Good morning, everyone. This morning's lesson is titled The Watch and the Watchmaker. Apologies to maybe Damien and those that have gone through my new converts class recently. But having started this series of new converts again for after a little while, this is one of the things that I always talk about probably in my first maybe one or two lessons. And I thought for this morning's lesson, we could look at it a little bit further and see what it actually has to say about God and who it is. And we're going to get to it in a moment. But I'd like to also thank Brother Pai Chen for his Lord's Supper talk, because I think there's a lot of things that are going on in people's minds. And going off Brother Adrian's sermon last week about war and peace, that I think these are topics that are in everyone's forefront in especially the world we live in at the moment, in society at present. Because just a quick Google search, and this was taken from yesterday, these were screenshots. I just went to Google, I went to news, I went to top stories, and this is what came up. So you can see on the screen. So I read the headlines. It says, US-Iran war, live updates. Iran shoots down 2 US warplanes, 2 crew rescued, and it goes on. So we can see that these events that are happening in the world around us are prominent, right? And I think everyone is aware of, at least to some extent, what is happening in the world around us. Or how about this one from the ABC? Russia launches Good Friday daytime attack on Ukraine, killing 14. And you can see just in these timestamps here that these are all recent news headlines. How about this one that maybe is a little bit closer to home? Oil crisis underlines indispensability of fossil fuels as key Aussie industries enter panic mode. Now, obviously, we've got some inflammatory language here that's used to, maybe stir up a little bit of panic in people. But, this is something that directly affects, I'm sure, everyone sitting in this room here. How about this one from 9news.com? Some Aussies are making diesel from cooking oil to avoid paying for petrol. Here's why that's a bad idea. And I hope that that is self-explanatory in and of itself, but I thought that was an interesting news headline. But what we can see is that, in the world around us, there is so much uncertainty. There is so much in the current times where we feel that we are struggling through world. We're struggling through life, and we don't know what tomorrow holds. And so let's take a few steps back. And before we examine what we can see about what the Bible has to say about topics like this, I want to introduce this topic called the watch and the watchmaker. And now this is a fairly famous argument about the existence of God, but for those that haven't heard of it, I want you to follow along with me. So, the caveat to this is that the original writer, which I'm going to explain on the next slide, talks about a much simplified version of this story, but just give me a moment for the purpose of this sermon to just have some, poetic license and just let me expand the story a little bit. So my version of the story is something like this. So imagine you live in a remote rainforest and you have no or minimal contact with the outside world, i.e. modern technology, the current advancements we have in the world at the moment. So you live in your own little town, in your own isolated village in the middle of nowhere, okay? So you maybe have never seen technology, you've never seen advancements in the world, and this is all you know. So you know what is in the world around you, okay? So every day, your day-to-day consists of you forage for food, you maybe hunt for animals to eat, you forage for plants to eat, you are looking for building a shelter, you're finding items to hunt or to survive, and you're looking for resources, and that's the world that you know. Okay, so that's the context, that's setting the scene. Now, the story of the watch and the watchmaker goes like this. So this is your life, this is all that you know, and all you see is the world around you, okay? That is what is familiar to you. And one day, as you are going about your time, you find this object on the ground. And what do you do? So now we're talking about a traditional watch. We're not talking about a smartwatch here. But you pick up this item, right? And if you have never been exposed to society or to technology, even this, fairly primitive technology, you pick it up and you're trying to see what this item is, right? So what do? Naturally, curiosity takes hold of you and you start to explore and have a look at what this object is, right? And so you can see that you've got this piece that is moving, right, in the watch, the second hand. And then you can see that over time, these things in the watch start to move, right? And then you get a little bit curious. So what do? You explore and you open up you open this thing up, right? And what are you going to see? You're going to see this battery, all right, or this mechanical, this silver thing, and then you're going to see these parts, these intricate parts of the watch that are what are controlling the movement, right? That you can see that there's these cogs and these other mechanical bits that are moving, and that's what powers the watch as it goes along. So once you have examined this watch, what is the conclusion that we can draw from this? So keep in mind, you only know the natural world around you, right? That is your life. So what are you going to think about how this watch came to be? Are you going to assume that this watch just appeared out of nowhere? So if you know what the world is around you, you know the animals, you know the plants, are you going to think that this watch has just sprung up from nature, just like all the other things you can see in the world around you, right? If you're going to ask yourself that question, what is the answer of that question going to be? And I think for most people, the logical answer to that question is no, because you don't find evidence of this watch in the rest of the world around you, right? You don't see a watch tree or a watch plant, or you don't see these watches springing up from the ground, and this is an isolated incident. You can also see the complexities in the watch of itself, and you would come to the logical conclusion that this is not something that is from nature. This hasn't just sprung up from nowhere and it hasn't just appeared. So if it hasn't been created from nature, it hasn't just been there, then what's the other possibilities it could be? Well, another possibility is that it has always existed, right? It has always been there since the beginning of time, just like the rest of nature around you, okay? But you live in this place is familiar to you, so is it going to be a logical conclusion that this has always existed? Well, no, because maybe you've gone through this path before and you've never seen this watch. So therefore, what's the third logical argument? Well, it's not come from nature, it hasn't always existed, so therefore it must have been someone else has created this thing, or it has been created by someone, and it has been left on the ground, or it's been dropped, or whatever it is, or it's been disposed of, and then you have found this watch, right? So the argument goes like this, that because this object has been found, and you can see and identify that it is not from the surrounding world, and you can identify that it is a complex item, and that is made up of all these intricate moving parts, that it has to have had a creator for this watch to have been created and then left there for you to find. So this idea of this watch and the watchmaker was first penned by this man called William Paley. He was an English clergyman and philosopher towards the end of his life in 1802. So that's a fairly, decent time away from where we are now, right? We're talking a few hundred years ago. And he actually penned it in a book that he wrote, and it's actually the first few lines of this book talking about the natural world around and evidence for God. But this was one of the first arguments that he wrote in this book. And really, essentially what he's trying to say, again, I've had a bit of poetic license if you would give me that about expanding the story, but his argument simply is that if you find a watch, there has to have been a watchmaker. That this thing just hasn't come out of nowhere, there has to have been someone that created this thing. And therefore, when you apply that argument to a simple watch, and you look at how complex this item is, and how isolated this item is, but still works for a particular purpose, that when we compare a watch to the world around us and us as individual humans, that if we can agree that a watch, because of what it is, has been created by someone, then what more evidence that the world around us, being significantly more, infinitely more complex and infinitely more grand than a watch, is also made by a creator as well. And without any knowledge of, again, going back to our little story, without any knowledge of how to make a watch, right? You yourself don't know how to do it, right? You yourself have no idea, have never seen this item before, and you yourself don't know any watchmakers, right? This would still be evidence that this was still created by someone. Even though you have never made it, you don't know how to make it, you don't know anyone that knows how to make it, the conclusion is that this item would still be made by someone. It still proves the existence of a watchmaker, even though you don't know a watchmaker, or you yourself are not a watchmaker. And this theory was actually, as I was researching this, was actually agreed upon by Charles Darwin, who is one of the founding fathers of the theory of evolution. And he, you can see, a few decades later in 1831, initially agreed with this theory in the argument of creation. Before, obviously, he then goes on to come up with his own theories. But this argument tells us a few things. By using this analogy or this story, we can actually see that it tells us a few things about God, and it tells us a little bit about the nature of who he is and the world around us. So follow along with me as I've got a few points, and let's see what the Bible has to say about this story. And the first thing is that the creation reveals God's design. That by looking at, going back to our story, the simple fact that the watch exists proves that there is a watchmaker, right? That matter cannot be created from nothing. So that the purpose of today's lesson isn't to go into apologetics. We're not going into, all the different reasons of why God exists. But the first thing we can see is that we have to, I think most of us can agree that something has to be created by something, right? That nothing is a possibility. We talked about it with Damien in our lesson this morning, but nothing is a possibility and nothing can continue to exist forever, right? That if I just keep looking at this pulpit here, I can stare at this pulpit for thousands and thousands of years, but nothing is going to appear there until someone creates something and puts it there, right? It's not just going to magically form something here on this pulpit. So we can see that all that is created around us is evidence of a creator, right? Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4 reads, "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." And this writer here essentially sums up that analogy of the watch and watchmaker in a single verse. Every house is built by someone. The fact that something exists is evidence that something was created or made by someone, right? And it even goes on to say the builder of all things is God. The person that is responsible for the creation of everything is God. And the world that we can see around us provides clear examples of God's power and creation. Because again, in this analogy, we're talking about a watch. But you think about the wonders of the world around us, right? We can think of mountains, rivers, oceans, valleys, the wonders of God's creation, are far more grand and far more magnificent than the workings of a simple watch. And, we can see that just by looking at the world around us provides evidence of that. If we turn to Psalm chapter 19, Psalm chapter 19, verse 1 reads, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands." And if you think about, the most beautiful places that you might have traveled to, these iconic sceneries in different parts of the world, this congregation is filled with people from all over the world, right? We all have different experiences of what we have seen in God's creation, right? And I'm sure we can agree that there are some very beautiful places on God's earth that he has created, right? And when we think about each of these places, we all have these different experiences, but we can agree that there is some grandeur in the world around us. There is something that we can look at and be amazed by what we can see in the world, from where we are. And so, it says that in this psalm that David's written, that the heavens, the things that are around us, the expanse of the world declares the work of God and his creation. And if we turn to Job chapter 12, Job chapter 12, reading from verse 7 to 9. "But now ask the beasts and let them teach you, and the birds of the heavens and let them tell you, or speak to the earth and let it teach you, and let the fish of the sea declare to you, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this," right? So, the scriptures here aren't talking about, literally talking to animals or talking to the earth, but the evidence that these animals, not just the world and the things we can see in terms of the physical things in the scenery, but also the animals, the existence of these things are all evidence of God's hand at work in creation. And though we physically can't see God, right? We can't look at God and it's something that we can tangibly look at or something that we can physically go to and see, we can see God's hand at work in amongst these things, that these things around us are evidence of God's hand in creation. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Romans chapter 1, verse 20 reads, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse," right? That the invisible attributes, the bits of God that we can't see, that we can't touch, we can't experience with our, senses here as humans, we can see as evidence through the world that has been created, that this is evidence of a creator at hand. And I think what is interesting is that this idea has, been maintained for thousands of years, right? The Watch and the Watchmaker was penned in the 1800s, but, when we talk about Psalms and in Job, we're talking, hundreds to thousands of years ago that these writers understood that the world around us is evidence of God's creation, and that the creation reveals, it says in the title slide, reveals God's design. And this something is that still holds true when Paul wrote this in Romans, a few hundred years later from the Old Testament, and then fast forward to now, where we are today in 2026, that these arguments still stand true, that the world around us declares that God has designed the world through what we can see and what we can experience. The second thing is that not only is this world, amazing, it's grand, but the complexity in the world points to intelligence. So not only is the fact of the watch existing evidence of a watchmaker, but we can also see that a watch is not just a simple object, that complex systems don't arise from randomness, and that detailed information always points to intelligence. Where there is complexity, there has to have been someone that has created it to be like that, right? And so the concept of the complexity in the watch helps prove the existence of the watchmaker. So for example, you could argue that, okay, the bits of the watch are from nature, right? That this isn't just created out of thin air, right? The metal is from the ground, maybe it's a leather strap, which is from an animal. All of those things are from individual parts of nature, but who is the one that has intricately put all those things together to form that watch that actually serves, the purpose of telling the time? It is able to, undergo these functions. There is a mechanism that works in it that had to have been created by someone, right? Those parts, the metal and the leather and whatever other bits of your watch, plastic, didn't just form together out of nowhere and didn't just come together to become a watch all of a sudden. There had to have been someone that put all those things together to form that watch as part of this analogy. And what that goes to show is that when we use that in the world around us, that there is order in the world, in the way that the world works. If we turn to Proverbs chapter 3, Proverbs chapter 3, reading from verse 19 and 20, it says, chapter 3, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew. That God in his wisdom and in his knowledge, as it says in these verses, created the world to work in a certain order, right? And it kind of talks a bit about this in verse 20. It says the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew. There is a way that the world works. And the idea is that even if humans didn't exist, even if humans were wiped out off the face of the earth, the world would still continue to exist, right? The world isn't reliant on humans to exist, that the world has been created in such a way that even if humans weren't there, right, that, the plants would still continue to exist and, nature would still continue to grow, but there is an order in the way that the world works. And I've just got this one example here. There are lots of things that we could talk about, but I've just chosen one example to emphasize this point. And that is in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 7. We're going to start there. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 7. And it says, all the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. And the writer of Ecclesiastes understands, right? And again, we're talking this, when was Ecclesiastes written? We're talking thousands of years ago, okay? That the writer notes that the water continually flows, right? And that generally rivers flow in one direction, right? So the rivers will always flow to a particular point, right? And how is it that the sea that the river flows into never overflows, right? That the water is always moving in one direction and it's always entering into the same sea or to the same lake or same body of water, but that body of water doesn't overflow, right? How is it that that's the case, right? Well, let's turn to Job chapter 36. Job chapter 36, reading verses 27 to 28. For he draws up the drops of water, they distill rain from the mist, which the clouds pour down, they drip upon man abundantly. Now, again, I'm not here to talk about the way rivers work and the whole reasoning behind that. Definitely no expert. But we can see that in Job here, there is one example of why this is the case, right? And he says, he draws up the drops of water, they distill rain from the midst, which the clouds pour down, right? What is this talking about? Well, this is talking about the water cycle, right? right? That there is evaporation, that it forms the clouds in the sky, and then the rain falls down. So we don't have, we physically cannot see the evaporation happening and this water cycle process going, just as we physically cannot see why the seas don't overflow, right? But it goes to show that when God created the world, he didn't just create it with randomness, right? He didn't just create it to simply exist, and there is chaos in the world, right? That things don't work, that it was created, and there is no order or purpose in it. But the way that God created the world is examples that it was created with intelligence, that there is a way in the world works, that there is a order, that we now, label it with science to mean certain things. But, God has created this long before man even understood what these concepts were, right? And again, we could use other examples, right? We could look at our bodies and you can see the way that these are extremely complex and the way that each individual bodily system works together cohesively for you to still function as an individual human being, right? In Psalm chapter 139, Psalm chapter 139, verses 13 and 14. For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it well. That again, this writer here of this psalm identifies that our bodies are extremely complex as well, and that even thousands of years ago, people understood that even when we look inwardly at ourselves, not even just at the world around us for the order, but even inwardly, there is complexity and intelligence that has been put into the design of each individual person. And this is intentional, right? That God didn't just put all these things in for no purpose, that there was a reason that God created us and created the world in this intelligent way. If we turn to Isaiah chapter 40 from verse 26, it says, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars, the one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them all by name. Because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing. And using the example here of the stars in the sky, when we look at the expanse in the night and all the stars that are out there, it says the one who leads forth their host by number, he calls them all by name. That God has this intelligence and understanding and wisdom beyond what we can even comprehend as a humanity, as a mankind. Collective intelligence is nothing in comparison to God and the world that he was able to create and design when we look at that. The third thing we can see is that design implies purpose. And going back to our analogy, when you look at the watch, we can see it serves a purpose, right? Now, the person that found the watch, or you, if you are putting yourself in those shoes, you might not necessarily know at that point in time what the purpose of this watch is. But we can see that it is not just created for nothing, that the watchmaker had a design in mind and fashioned it to be this way for a purpose. And this speaks to a higher logic and reasoning of the watchmaker, that there is a reasoning behind why the watch was designed this way. And again, applying that into the world around us, that God, in his wisdom, created the world to be a certain way for a purpose. If we turn to Proverbs chapter 16, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 4, it reads, the Lord has made everything for its own purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. That there is a reasoning behind why God has done things in this way. And the world could have been formed with no life, but God did not intend this to be so. Because if you think about all the possibilities of the world, God could have intended that humans didn't exist, or he could have intended it that animals didn't exist, or there's an infinite number of possibilities of things potentially existing that may have existed, or things not existing, right? That those are two rational possibilities for an endless number of things you could talk about and you could suppose. But we can see that God didn't just randomly pick a configuration and said, yes, I'm going to pick a world where humans exist and unicorns don't exist. But God had a purpose for why he created the world to be what it is today. If we turn to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, It reads, "For thus says the Lord who created the heavens. He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited." That the world was created for humans to live in. That was, again, the purpose of that. And why? Why is it so? Why did God create this world for us, for humanity? Well, because, again, we have been created by God for a purpose. Just as God created the world for a purpose to hold mankind, we as people, as Christians, as the people of this earth, have been also created for a particular purpose. That the design of not only the world, but the design of us implies that we have a purpose. If we turn to Isaiah 43, just a couple of chapters back. Isaiah 43, verse 7, "Everyone who is called by my name, and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made." Everyone who is called by my name. We have been called by God. And if we turn to Ephesians 2, verse 10, again, a well-known passage for a lot of people, I'm sure. Ephesians 2, verse 10, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." That we, as individuals, have purpose. That we haven't just been created, by God for nothing. That we individually have a purpose, which is to do good works, which is to be called by God, right? And this leads us to a flaw or a turning point in this argument, right? And so, again, we're going to pause for a moment. We're going to put that all to aside. We're going to go back to our analogy. Now, for a lot of people, there have been, when I was researching this, there are a lot of people that try to argue against this theory. If you even just type "watch and watchmaker argument," there's a Reddit thread that comes up with hundreds of replies as to why this is a false argument and how this disproves itself. And you can read about Charles Darwin and Richard Dawkins and how they have refuted this theory, right? And I guess some of the things that they're trying to say is that this theory is incomplete, or it doesn't talk about the complexities about creation and the world around us, right? But really we're boiling it down to a simple analogy, right? And just like any simple analogy doesn't explain all the complexities about the world or everything that it has to do with the world around us, right? And so, there are many things that this analogy doesn't tell us, right? It doesn't tell us how the watch ended up there in the first place. It doesn't tell us who created the watchmaker, right? Who was the person responsible for that? But I think it is important for us to focus on one aspect of God beyond this analogy. So going back to our, we've taken our pause, we're going to jump back into this idea that not only were we created for a purpose, but that God is personal. Because in our analogy, the watchmaker doesn't have a personal relationship with the watch, right? That in our story, the person found the watch on the ground and the watchmaker is not present, right? The watchmaker is not actively involved in this watch and isn't actively taking care of it, but simply is that the watch is evidence that the watchmaker exists, right? And this is one of the things, again, you can talk about many things that about this analogy that that doesn't explain, but just focusing on this one, we can see that the watchmaker, God, in our lives hasn't just abandoned us like this watch. He hasn't just created this world. He hasn't just created us and just left us be, and then we're just here trying to fumble our way through life, right? But we have been created in the likeness of God. Since the creation of mankind, all the way in the beginning of creation, God has created us individually to be in the likeness of him, right? Genesis chapter 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. That we individually have been created to reflect God, that our existence as mankind is that of one that reflects God. And he can see that isn't written about the animals or the world or the things that we can see around us, but we as humans are reflective of God's image. And again, we've talked about looking at the world around us, seeing how amazing, how majestic the world is, that the world was created by God. But that same God, right, that is able to do all of those things, that is able to create all of these things, is the same God that cares for us today, right? And the writer of Psalm chapter 8 goes on to explore this idea. Psalm chapter 8, verse 3-4. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" And, the writer here, I think, in these two verses so aptly puts it that in verse 3, he talks about, he's almost like, you do on Google Earth, where you scroll out and you zoom out of Perth and you zoom out of Australia and you zoom out of the world, and then you keep zooming out, and what do you see? You see, the stars, the moons, the heavens, it says here, right? That when we look and consider the grandness, the grandeur of creation, that what is man? What are we, these little, barely ants on the ground when God's looking from above, right? Who are we that God is able to create all these amazing things? We are just these little ants on the ground to God, right? But it says that God is still, as it says here, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? That same God that is able to create all these things still cares for each and every one of us, has a personal care and relationship with us. And that Creator has plans for us simply just being created. God didn't just create us and just left us there, right? That same God is actively involved in our lives, in the choices that we make, in the actions that we take, and in the things that we do. In Jeremiah 29, verse 11, a memory verse I'm sure a lot of people, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope." And Romans 8:28, again, another memory verse. Romans 8:28, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." That there is a personal relationship that we can have with God, and that God has plans for each and every one of us. So as we think about the evidence of God, the evidence of God's creation, the fact that the world around us shows intelligent design, the fact that God, this same God, has a personal relationship with us, what is our response to all of this? How do we react, and what do we do? What are the next steps from here, right? Well, the first thing is do we use a watch as a paperweight? What is the purpose of the watch, right? The watch has a purpose to tell the time. And so does that mean that we can't use it, for example, as a paperweight? We can, but that's not what it was designed to do, right? That just as God is near us, we have been created for a purpose, to seek after God. And that we as individuals have been told that we have purpose from God. And part of that purpose is to seek after him, because God has created us, yes, but if we choose to not accept this purpose, then are we utilizing ourselves to the purpose that God wanted us, to our full ability, as God would have created us for? If we turn to Acts chapter 17, Acts chapter 17, verses 24 to 27, it reads, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us." And these first three verses that we've just read, from verses 24 to 26, again, we can see that what is being mentioned in these verses is that we're emphasizing that in verse 24 that God has created all these things around us, and that same God doesn't dwell, right, in these temples, isn't just there for us to, come down and bow ourselves before him, and didn't create, wasn't created by man, right? And he doesn't rely on mankind to exist. God doesn't need humanity to, God isn't reliant on us to exist. But it says that the purpose that we have, and the fact that God created and even gave us a pathway through Jesus, the reason why he did all of those things is so that we can seek him. So the response that we should have is, if God has done all these things for us, our purpose is to seek after him. Our purpose is to look for him and find him. It says, though he is not far from each one of us. If we seek God, we will find him. And therefore, our lives should and need to reflect our Creator. If we turn to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Which reads, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." How are we going to present ourselves to God in the way that he asks of us? It says we are to present our bodies a living and holy sacrifice. Now, this doesn't mean we need to, give our lives up for God, but it means in a spiritual sense, in a metaphorical sense, that is what we need to do, that we dedicate our lives and that we seek God and we choose to serve God and seek after him. And beyond that, God wants to have a relationship with us, right? God is reaching out for us, but it says here, our response, we are the ones that need to come to him. We need to be the ones that make the effort, that go to God. It's not that God, it's not that we're just sitting around waiting for God to tap us on the shoulder. Is that God wants us to be there. We just need to be the ones to reach out to him. James chapter 4, verse 8, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. That once we draw near to God, he is going to make that effort and draw to us. So, as we wrap this lesson up, bring it to a conclusion, a watch can only exist if it is designed and created by a watchmaker. And the world that we can see around us and our existence are proof that God exists and that God is creator over all. And that based on this knowledge, right, our response should be that we give God the recognition and honor that he deserves. If you go to Revelation 4, verse 11, this is our scripture reading and is our final passage for today. Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. It says, worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. We need to live and act as the Creator purposed us to. And jumping all the way back to the very start of this lesson, is that in the world that we can see around us, right, that is filled with uncertainty, is filled with, stress and anxiety and worry about what the future might hold, that we need to remember that beyond all of these things, beyond just the world that we can see, is that there is a God, there is a creator who lives and is beyond these things. And so we have a responsibility to come to God, to accept him for who he is. And, we would love to tell you more about what God expects of us. So as we reflect on what we've discussed, I want you to think about this as we stand and sing our hymn for this morning.